I just wanted to have a short conversation, not take our whole 20 minutes or so, but a short conversation about where you think prediction is going in your various fields. We just heard Laura give essentially a whole talk about things that are almost unobservable. So, those clearly are predictions. They have less impact on our life, although they might someday, you never know, than the rest of yours. But if you all just want to kind of just jump right in, go ahead and see. It's hard on Zoom to all talk at the same time, so just go ahead and try. Or I can single you out. I can say, Randi, what do you think?
Oof, don't start with me. You're thinking about predictions?
About if you were going to say, in other words, when we were talking, for example, during your talk about the coral reefs and that the coral reefs managed to come back. If you were to take what you know, either empirically or theoretically in some way about the biology and ecology of coral reefs, could you tell me, if I found you a ruined reef and I said, okay, I'll leave it alone under such and such conditions for 20 years, could you tell me what it's going to look like? Do we know that? Or is it all just we need examples of everything?
This is something I've been thinking about for a long time. There's something in sort of an ecological sort of concept of succession, right? So thinking about the transition of ecosystems and how they start in the beginning or after a major disturbance and move through until they reach what's called a climax ecosystem, until they reach a stable place where they'll stay for a while. And we haven't really watched coral reefs do that from beginning to end enough to know what the indicators are, to sit there and say, okay, coral reef ecosystem in place X, Y, or Z, you're this far along on this pathway or trajectory, and we know exactly how long it's going to take you to get to the end. And I think there's a couple reasons we don't know that. One is that there are very few opportunities to sort of witness a completely denuded coral reef, or previously, right, under a natural situation and watch it regrow all the way through. So there are some places where actually there's been some lava flow and you can get a reef starting from scratch. But oftentimes if there's disturbance, it's, especially these days, right, there's multiple disturbances happening again and again and again and again and again. So those successional trajectories keep getting interrupted. So I think it's really hard to say at any given reef at any given time, how long is it going to take and to end? Will it ever reach its former glory or what it used to look like before? The other thing that I think I'll say about that is that there's no guarantee at any point in any disruption, right, that an ecosystem will return to exactly what it looked like previously. And so a lot of these changes or disruptions that we see are, there's an element of stochasticity to them. And I think that is augmented and amplified under the conditions of global change. So what I can tell you is that in a place like the Phoenix Islands, where we have no people, really, there's 25 people roughly on one island out of 8. And so imagine 25 people in a place the size of California, really far away, where the closest people to you, Laura, this is for you, are on the International Space Station, times a couple of factors depending on where it is in its orbit. We have the best chance of being able to answer that. And what I can tell you is that we do see recovery and in a relatively quick time frame. So in the order of a decade up to 2, you can see recovery happen fairly quickly. But does it look the same as it did before? And at any given point, if I could look at it, could I tell you that it would be the same again? No. And I think it's that element of stochasticity and in our time of modern global change that really complicates that question.
Right. And so you just certainly don't have enough examples to sample those statistics, especially if they're so unpredictable like that. Yeah.
I think it's also that the world is changing too fast for us to be able to see how these corals are going to respond in real time. And I also think this is a little maybe funny to say, but I think there's a real place-based contextualization to this, where not every reef and every place is going to respond the same way. There's a lot of local factors that are going to contribute. So even if we had a couple of examples from a couple of places, I'm not sure that they would port the world over. I think that there's a really important localization factor.
I'll just put in a plug. Later, well, actually next year, we're having a big science symposium called The Future of the Future, because yours truly is obsessed with prediction. And it talks about how we'll make predictions in the future. And so I'm going to not monopolize this conversation talking only about prediction unless somebody else wants to jump in. I'm instead just going to say one thing and then turn it over to Chris, which is that in my own work on prediction, I have found now many, many times. If you look at the difference between Laura and Laura, not Laura, but physics, okay, where we've had kind of predictive theories for a very long time. She's making predictions of things that, like I said, not insultingly, kind of amazed, you can't see, okay, like, but she's quite seriously using physics to make those calculations. And then if you look at what Cindy was talking about, she's talking about at some level biology, but at some level chemistry. And I'm guessing that's a little bit more predictable. And then the closer you get to biology and, God forbid, human behavior, it's like completely unpredictable, right, Hilary? And so, that's something that if you stick around for the breakout rooms, I think it might be interesting to talk about that some more. So if anybody has a very quick question or a comment about that, go ahead. But otherwise, I'm going to turn it right over to Chris. But does anybody want to say anything about that quickly?
Well, I'll just echo what you just said, Alyssa, about this difference in our ability to predict physics versus chemistry versus biology, which I think about a lot in using the kind of global Earth system models that we use to make projections about climate change. And so these are giant models run on supercomputers where we have to write an equation for every teeny tiny grid cell on the entire Earth and the ocean, land, atmosphere. And so we have to write equations for all of the physics, chemistry, biology, and ecosystem processes. And we know those equations for the physics of how the climate works way better than for the ecosystems. They're missing so many of the components that, say, Randi brought up in her talk to be able to think about how ecosystems are going to respond to these changes. And I'll say that we're missing both having the observations like Randi was describing to be able to write those equations. And we're actually at this point still also missing the computational power. Even if we were to try to parameterize everything we knew about biology, we actually don't have the supercomputing power to even be able to run those models with all of that.
Thank you. You just summarized my whole prediction class. So thank you very much. And I'm glad to hear a real expert on climate say what I have sort of indirectly gleaned to be true over the last 5 or so years. So Chris, what was the question that you wanted to ask?
Yeah, I think I've got a question that manages to pull together a whole bunch of questions from the audience and should interest several of you. So, and leading off from predictions, and of course, we learn a lot about predictions by learning from the past. So I wonder about the history of water on Earth. What do we know about that? Has the amount of water on Earth always been the same on the surface of the Earth, or has it changed? Do we know if it's changed? And what do we know about how temperature and carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which affect the acidification of the ocean, how have they changed over the 3 billion years, at least, when we have had life on the planet? I'm just wondering how much we know about the history of water and the ocean on Earth. I'm sure Hilary, Randi, Laura for sure have things to say on that.
Well, I can definitely speak to sort of history of water on the surface of the Earth. And in fact, we don't know its history as well as we would like to, because the Earth is a geologically active planet. And so unfortunately, it tends to erase all the evidence that we want to look at. But we do have good evidence from the last about 500 to 700 million years that the sea level relative to the continents has been relatively constant. We can also measure present day rates of volcanism and calculate ingassing rates and look at how much subduction is going on and compare that to, so ingassing rates and outgassing rates, we compare that and see that they're close to a steady state at the present day, although there does seem to be a little bit more flux of water going into the mantle right now than there is coming out of the mantle. And so that would support some of these models that suggest slowly as the planet ages, what happens is that the rate of plate tectonics tends to slow down as the mantle cools off and convection slows. And so you get transport of water into the mantle, and there isn't sufficient heat to melt as much of it, and so less of it comes back out. And so that's what we predict to happen, is that as the planet ages, there should be less water present on the surface. Now, the other complicating factor in trying to understand the history of water on the surface is we don't know how the size or the mass of continents on the surface has changed. On the Earth, we have continents and we have oceans, and it's because the ocean floor is much lower than the continents that we have these big ocean basins. But continents are produced by sort of a secondary process after the formation of oceanic crust. And so we think that continents were not necessarily present in the same abundance over the course of the Earth's history as they are today. And so that complicates our interpretation of the geologic record and understanding the history of water on the Earth.
Okay. So Hilary, how about pH and temperature changes in the ocean over deep time?
Yeah, so I was actually going to bring up here the idea that we can think about these questions on a really wide range of timescales, right? Laura, you're thinking about over the entire history of the Earth and how these things have changed over time. And this is something I like to bring up in teaching my intro oceanography class, that when we're talking about like, where did the ocean come from, plate tectonics, why do we have ocean basins, we're thinking about very different timescales than what I think about in my research trying to understand recent climate evolution and how climate will change in the future. So for instance, thinking about the total amount of water in the oceans today, if I'm thinking about, say, paleoclimate records, I'm often thinking about what's happened over, say, the past 800,000 years, very short timescales on what Laura was talking about, and thinking about how much of that water is in the ocean versus is locked in ice on land. And so we can make calculations of how relative sea level is changing over time as we move our water between being stored in ice on land and our large ice sheets today in Antarctica and Greenland versus having that water in the ocean. And Chris, you were also asking about the question of ocean acidification and how the pH of the ocean has changed over time. And I would say that our paleo proxies for ocean acidification are much newer and still more under development than our proxies for understanding sea level and how the total amount of water in the oceans has changed over time. So I'll say that's an area where we're still calibrating those proxies to try to figure out what they can tell us about really long time scales and how that might inform how we think about ocean acidification will change going forward.
I'm so glad you brought up timescales, Hilary, because there's a related question here for Cindy. And the way I can relate it to timescales, the way it's related to timescales in my head is that ocean acidification and changes in the composition of the ocean. I'll tell you later how I spent time at Goddard with all those ice cores once upon a time. But yeah, people have these drillings, you know, beneath the surface of the ocean that have these unbelievable fossil records of the chemistry of the ocean. But Cindy, we don't have any fossil records of, you know, weird chemical pollutants or plastic that we were hearing about from Randi, you know, in the fossil record, right? So we have even less data. And so you were talking mostly about the effect of the PFAS on humans, the potential effect on humans. But one of the audience members wants to know more about if anybody is studying their effect more broadly on marine ecosystems. And I just say that this is on short timescales because, first of all, it's only been a problem for a very short time. And secondly, to go back to what everybody else is saying, there's almost no data because this is unprecedented. And so what is the story with kind of wider studies of the dispersion of these things over time?
Yeah, speaking of timescale here, for PFAS, we're only going to look at the past several decades because that's when the chemicals start to be manufactured in the 1950s. But from that point onward, I've read research doing studies in ice cores, actually, Alyssa, to your point, near the polar regions, because PFAS is extremely persistent. It has this potential to go on long-range transport. And one of the ways to study how PFAS generated in like where humans tend to live, mid and low latitude, get all the way up to the polar region is by looking at atmospheric deposition. And researchers have used ice cores to study that. So I just want to quickly respond to your comment there and then answer your question on the impact of PFAS on marine life. And I think Hilary mentioned this in her talk, like ocean is the ultimate sink. for a lot of things, and PFAS is one of them. So with PFAS, it's got emitted into the air, and the biological pump that was also brought up by previous speakers that is responsible for pumping carbon dioxide from surface atmosphere into the ocean is also responsible for transporting some of the PFAS and PFAS precursors in the air into the surface ocean. And then from there, we're actually able to measure PFAS in phytoplanktons, and from phytoplanktons, they enter the food web or the food chain with biomagnification all the way, depending on how high you want to count up to the food chain. And then one of my previous collaborators is studying whales in Faroe Island, and they're pretty high up in the food chain through biomagnification. A lot of very high concentrations of PFAS could end up in the whale's body, and they are important for indigenous people living in those regions because whale meat is their cultural food, and a lot of people do rely on whales as their nutritional resource, and that has led to another whole suite of public health problems. It's also pretty challenging to do intervention because on one hand, we don't want populations living there get exposed to environmental chemicals. On the other hand, it is part of their culture and their traditional diet.
Yeah, it's pretty very complicated. I think Chris has a question.
Yeah, just leading on from that, you're saying that these organics like PFAS are very persistent. Presumably they hang around for hundreds or thousands of years potentially. So are we do we run the risk of contaminating our water supply, irreversibly? And do you think there's a risk that we're going to run out of drinking water in the future? And if so, do you have any solutions to that, through groundwater or desalination of ocean water or what?
Yeah, those are a lot of big questions, and I'm sure my fellow panelists can speak more adequately to the quantity of water. On the persistence side, I'll just quickly mention that PFAS, if you look at the chemical structure of PFAS, it's characterized by this carbon-fluorine chain, and carbon-fluorine chain is the strongest bond we know in organic chemistry because the two atoms are so small and the bond between them are so strong. That is why PFAS are persistent and they almost never break down. If you are really trying to look at their lifetime in the environment, it's probably on the scale of millennials. And due to the persistence, once they get into the water supply, it is really hard to remove them unless you use other ways like filter them out. But even though we use filters, then the question comes, what do you do with the filters that contain all these chemicals? So if you want to 100% absolutely eliminate PFAS from the filters, then you have to go up to very high temperature that breaks down the carbon-fluorine bond, but that is very extreme condition. And I'll probably just stop here and let other fellow panelists address the water availability and quantity question.
Thanks. Who wants to take that question? Chris, did you have someone in mind you wanted to pick on?
I was wondering if Hilary maybe has some perspectives on this in terms of, the energy required for desalinating salt water to convert it into drinking water, and the need for, again, petrochemicals to provide the energy to desalinate the water. If, we're always, within this cycle of this dependency on petrochemicals, sometimes it just seems so difficult to wean ourselves off of it. We're going to have to find alternatives. And you clearly think about these things very often as well. And what do you see in terms of alternative energy sources that will avoid us contaminating our oceans, our water supply with organic pollutants, with microplastics and so on? Randi, maybe you have some things to say too.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are really big questions, and I'll certainly say that drinking water supply and the availability of groundwater are outside, I think, any of our areas of the folks who are here today. But certainly this question you raised of if we were to reach a point that we didn't have adequate freshwater supply and needed to desalinate ocean water, clearly one problem in that is the incredible amount of energy that is required to do that kind of desalination. And then also making sure to be careful about the quality of that water, which is definitely also outside my expertise. But right, as we think about like the microplastics that Randi has been talking about, if you go to the store and you buy sea salt that they've evaporated, there are microplastics in that sea salt because there's microplastics in the water. And so thinking carefully about the kinds of questions that Cindy raised for the quality of the water would also be relevant for thinking about desalination processes. And then, of course, these questions you raised, Chris, of trying to switch the energy that we use from being petrochemicals to thinking about sustainable energy sources like solar and wind. I'm not sure there's a particular difference in the way we would do that for thinking about desalination versus other things that we need to use energy for. We need to make those choices even independent of needing extra energy to supply our drinking water. But I think it does raise this larger question that as we think about changing the energy we use, we're also going to need to think about adaptation to ongoing climate and environmental changes. People often talk about that with things like air conditioning and making sure that we have the energy to do all the things we need to do, not only to mitigate climate change, but also adapt to it at the same time.
Yeah, thanks, Hilary. I'm going to ask the last question to two people in kind of two parts. And so we have a big question here that was asked by the audience that says, what is so special about water that allows it to enable life? So that is a huge question, but I'll turn it into sort of just two pieces. And so I'll ask Laura about studies of other planets. We'll put that second, where people are doing these observational studies, which people also asked you a lot about, Laura, even though I know that's not really exactly your area, but people want to know, how do we look for water as evidence of life? So we can talk about that on exoplanets. But then the other one is Randi. We've heard from Cindy and Hilary. We know from personal experience why humans need water. We're pretty sure about human biology and what happens to if you don't have enough water. But coral is like underwater, and I'm pretty sure that if you take it out of the water, all that pretty white coral we see is dead. And so could you just tell us like a teeny little, freshman biology explanation of why coral needs water? And then we'll end with Laura telling us about people looking or not looking for evidence of life by only using water or something else. So go ahead, Randi. Do you have a quick answer for the stupid physicist who doesn't know enough biology to even understand why corals need water?
Love conversations like this. It's so fun. I have to tell you, I have never once sat there and questioned or even thought about why corals need water, because they do, right? They're but I guess it's the medium that they live in, right? And so their entire biology is adapted to this medium, right? Their food is, being filtered from water. They have structures. I don't even want to really call. They're not nearly as complex as humans, or a larger or more derived animal that has a whole lot of sort of different compartments and organs and complex tissue structure. But for what they have, right, they are depending on the physical properties of water to maintain, for example, the fluid pressure in their gastrovascular cavity, right, or in their
right.
polyp extension, right. And so they have these fluid-filled tissues that are constantly in contact with water. And
so they basically have evolved perfectly to live in water. And if we mess that up, we mess that up.
Life came from water, right? So it's not like
perfect transition. Okay, Laura,
we have water. I mean, we started in water.
We're going to go to the breakout rooms very soon. So Laura, in 1 minute or less, tell us why people are constantly looking for water as evidence for life on other planets.
Right. So NASA, because it is in the business of trying to find life both in the solar system and exoplanets, has come up with a definition of life. And it's sort of, it's an interesting definition. It is that life is a self-perpetuating chemical system that can undergo Darwinian evolution. And you notice there's no mention of water anywhere in that. But fundamentally, we're looking for water because the only example of life that we know of requires water. The origins of life scenarios that have been developed for the Earth all require chemical reactions that are happening in a medium that allows easy transport of anions and electrons. And the fundamental solvent on the Earth is water. And water is so ubiquitous in the universe. It is made of hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, and oxygen is, I don't know, 5 or 6. So it's very abundant. It forms everywhere. It is ubiquitous to many planetary systems. And so we're looking for what we know, because until we find a second example, we don't have any other clues for which to direct our searches.
Got it. I'm just going to quote my friend and colleague Bob Kirshner, who used to be, who's emeritus now in the Harvard Astronomy Department. He was interviewed that year, I think it was 1995 or 96, when the first planets outside the solar system were found. And at that point, the same way that we're looking only for water now as a way to think about life, he said, you know, we were only looking for solar systems that look exactly like our solar system. And if you don't know, the first solar, I mean, Laura knows, but the rest of you, if you don't know, the first solar systems that were found were nothing like our solar system. They had these giant Jupiter-like planets next to the star that was being observed. And you know, it was kind of like, who ordered that, you know? And so I don't know if someday we're going to find a planet or life that doesn't involve water. But thank you for that answer, Laura. And thank you all so much. And I just have to publicly thank the events staff at Radcliffe and the people in academic ventures who made this program so incredibly seamless. And thanks again to everyone.